To discuss this topic, fundraising from Europe today, we have four great speakers. Arnaud Rottenecker, Executive Director, Chaplain York Europe Foundations. Emilie Compignie, FC Consulting, and one of our Chaplain York fundraising experts. She's based in Geneva. Becky Gilbert, Development Director at Assist in Berlin, and also one of our Chaplain York experts. Unfortunately, our head of international philanthropy, Heather Hill, couldn't make it today. She has an emergency with a client she had to work on like now, and she's replaced by our managing director, Nancy Bikson. Welcome, Nancy. Before we start, can we just go around the room and the table, and can you guys introduce yourself quickly? Anna?
Yes, thank you. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this webinar. As Arnaud said, I'm the director of the Chaplain York European Foundations, which are based in Switzerland and in the Netherlands. I have been the executive director of the foundation before in Hong Kong, so I have a fair share of experience in international philanthropy within Chaplain York, and I'm very happy to share all this with you today in a very short context that I will give you later on cross-border philanthropy. Thank you.
Thank you, and Emilie.
Yeah, thank you, Arnaud, and hi to everyone. Thank you for having me here. So I'm Emilie. I'm a fundraising consultant based in Geneva, founder of EC Consulting. I've been working on different markets in fundraising, so different markets within Europe, such as France, Germany, or Switzerland, for instance, but also in North America, and especially Canada. And I'll give you an overview of what you should know about fundraising in Europe.
Thank you. Becky?
So hi, everyone. This is Becky. I live in Berlin. I'm a US native, but I've lived in Berlin for a lot longer than I can actually imagine. It makes me a little bit older than I'd like to be. I'm super delighted to be here today. I'd like to talk to you about international fundraising that we do for Assist, which is a nonprofit organization with headquarters in the United States, but active around the world and giving scholarships to high school students for 1 year at independent schools in the United States. And we are raising funds around the world with a big home base in Europe. And that's what I'd like to speak about later.
Thank you, Becky. Nancy?
Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us. On behalf of Chaplain York, generally, we're very pleased to see such a large group and so much interest in what is really an important topic to everyone. I'm going to end the seminar on talking a little bit about the tax and legal things you need to know. Don't worry, I'm not going to talk about each of the 28 plus countries that are in the EU and in the surrounding European market. But it's worth knowing a little bit. I mean, in other words, we know that people don't give because of tax reasons, but if you can offer tax benefits, it's worth being able to do so. We'll tell you how we can help you, but also others can as well. So thank you very much for joining us. Arnaud.
Thank you, Nancy. Before we start, just to let you know, if you have questions, you can write them in the chat. This is a 1-hour webinar. If we have some time at the end of the session, you can ask questions online, but I'll read the question on the chat. And we are going to start right away with our first speaker, Arnaud Rottenecker. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Arnaud. I'm actually going to be very brief. I would like to complement what Arnaud said in his introduction to the webinar in the beginning on the potential of the European market for international fundraising. We have searched several studies to find out how much of this potential is actually shared across the border. As you can imagine, detailed figures are quite hard to come by, but there were 2 studies, and there's mainly one I would like to talk to you about, which is a study from the Global Philanthropy Tracker. They did a research amongst 47 countries in 2020, and these are the latest numbers we actually do have, so I hope the new ones are coming out pretty soon. Amongst these 47 countries, there were 21 countries from Europe. And altogether, they shared $70 billion in philanthropic cross-border flows. And if I say philanthropic cross-border flows, we don't talk about official development assistance. We don't talk about remittances. We really talk about private donations, philanthropists, foundations, high net worth individuals, etc. So amongst these 47 countries, as I said, it's $70 billion in 2020 only. And the share that came from European countries is over 20%, which is quite a big share on the $70 billion US. The study has found a very significant contribution, actually. And we can see that most of these philanthropic cross-border donations come from 12 main countries, which are Spain, the UK, the Netherlands, Switzerland, Sweden, France, Denmark, Germany, and Belgium, Luxembourg, Italy, and Norway. And if we compare what the results of these studies with previous studies that had been undertaken and with our own experience, we can actually confirm the potential of these markets for cross-border philanthropy. And it's with this very short context that I would like to hand back to Arnaud and then over to my two colleagues who will really share their insights and practical experience on how to do that and how to be best prepared. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And our next speaker is Emilie, EC Consulting, based in Geneva with this great international experience. So we want to hear from you now, Emilie.
Thank you, Arnaud. Thank you very much. So I'll try to, this is a very, very vast topic, but I'll try to give you at least some ideas of what should you know about fundraising in Europe. So like any geography, Europe has its specificities when it comes to fundraising. International fundraising, you may be aware of that, involves navigating different things such as legalities, regulations, cultural and social nuances specific to each targeted country. From abroad, Europe is usually seen as one continent, but even though there are very strong links between the member countries, there is no such thing as a one-pronged approach to fundraising in Europe. So that's what I'm going to try to show you. So let me first give you some very general insights at the European level. So first point would be to consider the local economic and social context. If the Europe and the European Union has been quite stable these past years, it's important to consider that the context evolves and great changes happens that directly or indirectly impact fundraising. We all know that now. As an example, after the COVID crisis, now the Ukraine war, we have seen a dramatic rise in the cost of living in Europe. As a result, for instance, and the way it impacts fundraising, the amount of money donated by individuals at the European level decreased by 32% in 2022 compared to 2021. So depending on your target, whether this is foundations, government, individual giving, it might be worth considering when is the best time to start your fundraising activities in Europe. A second point would be to look at local fundraising challenges and strategies. So what are the local nonprofits doing? What are the challenges? It is also a source of information. In a 2022 report published by the European Fundraising Association, 47% of the participants to a survey said that raising sufficient funds remains a major challenge. In response, 31% said that they have increased investment, for instance, in communication and marketing. In that survey, we also learned that close to a third of respondents said that they had decreased the number of events they organize, because there was also a decrease in individual giving income that was shared. But there was, for instance, an increase in funding from grants and foundations. Regarding fundraising strategies, of course, it evolves to adapt to these new trends, and it is crucial, I think, for a foreign organization to have an overview of these trends. In 2023, for instance, the main areas of focus in fundraising strategies are digital development, support to care, regular giving, and channel diversification. Now, what are the big trends at the European level? So, as Anna mentioned, though it is difficult to make accurate comparisons of charitable giving across Europe due to the differences in data available from each nation, we can access estimates and big trends. So if we look at foundations, for instance, it is estimated that there are 147,000 foundations in Europe. These foundations manage 511 billion euros in assets and endowments and give an estimated 60 billion euros annually. In another recent studies from the European Research Network on Philanthropy, the UK and Germany were seen to be the biggest givers. Behind the UK, the top nations for individual giving are Italy and Germany. And for bequests, for instance, this is Switzerland and France. Now, the top charitable causes, you may want to know also what are the top charitable causes that are supported across Europe. So children and young people is a top cause in 9 European nations. Then comes healthcare and medical research in 7 European nations. Then international development in 5 countries, and poverty, emergency services, and social care come next in 4 European countries. Perhaps the very last point before we zoom in on the differences within Europe, but the last point on the legislation, something that is actually quite important. You may be aware that in 2018, there is the General Data Protection Regulation, what we call GDPR, came into effect. And it's been the biggest overhaul of data protection legislation for over 25 years. So most national fundraising associations indicated that charities in their country were underprepared for this regulation. So imagine if this is complex to navigate for European nonprofits, it's also clearly a challenge to consider for foreign organizations. Now, a few other things, but let's zoom in on the differences within Europe. I was mentioning earlier that Europe is not to be considered as one big market, but as multiple markets with their own specificities. So I'm going to give you 4 concrete examples that are Germany, France, Switzerland, and Spain. If we look at Germany, what we learn is that Germany is the 2nd largest philanthropic market. And corporate giving is particularly prevalent, with companies giving 43% of the fundraised income. In France, this is different. The charitable sector is more reliant on donations from private donors, and it's closely followed by incomes from foundations and bequests. Now, if we look at Switzerland, foundations contribute to more than half of the total amount given in Switzerland. And we can also usually, Switzerland and the UK have very similar trends in their donation trends. If we look at Spain nonprofits rely heavily on income from foundations at actually 62%, which is huge. And in comparison, corporate donations are very marginal, and almost a quarter of donations are given from individuals. So that's very specific data and facts that I'm giving you, but it's just to really illustrate how different the market is depending on the country you want to target within the European market. Again, if we look at the legal environment, you also want to consider that there are differences. So there is a report that is proposing actually 4 categories of tax systems. The first one being tax deduction, so a reduction in the gross amount on which tax is calculated. So it's, for instance, the case in Denmark, Norway, or Switzerland. There is also the tax credit, so that's an amount that can be deducted from the actual tax to be paid. This is the case, for instance, in France, in Hungary, or in Spain. There is also the hybrid, a combination of both tax deduction and tax credit. It's the case in Belgium, in Portugal, in Slovakia. And there is also, for some countries, which are Ireland and Turkey, no tax system in place. Now, a very last point on cultural differences. So the history and of the philanthropy and the cultural differences are really to be considered. Each ecosystem works differently, and donors are not necessarily to be approached in the same manner. As an example, many French nonprofits encounter themselves lots of challenges in raising funds in Switzerland, and they don't even understand why. So there is a common mistake really to consider that neighboring countries are very similar when they actually are not. So relationships to money, mindsets of the inhabitants, the knowledge, interest of the nonprofit sector, interest about philanthropy, the social, economic, religious origins as well are some key elements to take into account on how you also approach, how you will approach your prospects and your donors. Another very simple example, I was discussing last year with a Spanish friend, and he questioned me a lot about the nonprofit sector and my work as a fundraising consultant, explaining that in Spain, the trust of the general public towards associations and NGOs is actually very low. So to conclude, despite these challenges, Europe remains a market full of opportunities for foreign nonprofits. Moreover, we see a constant increase in cross-border and transnational giving within the EU and beyond as well. A good understanding of this market, combined, I think, with professional support from people with expertise, knowledge, a network such as Chapel in York, for instance, in the country you are targeting, is essential to ensure the success of your fundraising campaign on the European market, or at least considering all these aspects before you want to start fundraising in Europe. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emilie. Your international experience is really interesting, and I think that's what we bring at Chapel in York. And most of our Chapel in York experts have this international experience. Now we're going to hear from Becky.
Yeah, I want to start off by thanking Anna and Emilie as well. I took a lot of notes, so I can only second what Arnaud says. So my job today is to talk a little bit about practice, boots on the ground, and just sort of report out of what we're seeing through our fundraising activities at Assist, and also in discussions with experts such as the Chapel in York network. And I think one of the main messages I wanted to sort of convey to all of the fundraisers out there is that, you know, fundraising in Europe is not, it's not impossible. It's a lot of fun, and with the right team in place, you will be successful. Just because as we start into this topic, it was already pointed out, it's complex, it's wide, but at the end of the day, there are rules, there are best practices, and there are definitely tactics and strategies that you can develop. So that's what I sort of wanted to talk a little bit about today. And the first is that I really want to encourage you to start with your own theory of change as fundraisers, just like you would do in your home market, wherever that may be, with your target audiences that you're familiar with the donors you've been working with, whichever background they may have, whether they're corporate, foundation, individual, trusts, etc. Start with the theory of change. What do you wish to accomplish? And really, why is this relevant to Europe in the bigger sense of the word? And then as you start to target your activities and really think about what Europe is going to mean to you, I think that's a really key activity. And then, just as you would do at home when you're opening up a new business line or a new area of fundraising that may be really unfamiliar to your organization, you're also going to think about whom in Europe and why is this the case. And I think we heard some really wonderful, and I took lots of notes, really exceptional information from both of the speakers today. And I know we're going to hear some great stuff from Nancy at the end as well, that is going to help you have a quantitative process that will really help you shape and focus the work that you're doing. And you're also going to want to go into this with a qualitative process, perhaps a feasibility study, just as many of you would do if you're starting off with a new capital campaign or a major gifts fundraising initiative, or maybe even a new challenge grant that you're working on. You're going to want to make a set of goals, just like you would do at home. These are SMART goals, like we all learned in Fundraising 101 a long time ago. And at the end of the day, when you approach this topic also of your European diversification of your fundraising strategies, you're going to have to figure out whom you want to accomplish what and with and by when. And I think this will naturally lead also to perhaps an internal audit of your ability to implement. Now, again, this is teamwork, and the people on the screen are a lot of people who can join your team down the road. And I know as fundraisers, executive directors, representatives of charities, you've also got a lot of people around you who will surely want to help you tap into this wonderful set of resources and this exciting market that the speakers who went before me talked a lot about. There's a lot of potential out there, and you can really start building your team and the people around you who will complement the knowledge that you have. And I think that that's a really important item to stretch. This is sort of to stress. It's an institutional readiness moment, and that's why we want to give you everything that you need to have a successful journey before you even start off on that journey. I'd also like to stress now from the fundraiser perspective, professional, but not necessarily perfect. None of us is 100% perfect in our day-to-day as fundraisers. There's no reason to expect your first European campaign is going to be perfect, but you need it to be professional. And this is where you get back to the framework that we've been talking about, the cultural nuances, the legalities, and the regulations. If you can always approach this work with that framework, taking what you know and what your strategic objectives are going to be, and then adding your European framework and your European knowledge and the insights that you're getting from this group of people and elsewhere, you will surely have a good start to your campaign. We learned about the big trends. And we also, I already mentioned the fact that I think having a team in place to help you interpret those big trends is really key. And from there, once you've done sort of this analysis, thought about your case for support in Europe, why would it matter to Europeans? And then, of course, taking what we heard before, Europe not being a monolith, what part of Europe is this really going to even be valuable in, worthwhile in, and what aspects of what you've heard today are you going to take to try to start building your strategy? Where are you going to start? You don't want to replicate the French foundation that's having difficulties in Switzerland. And I can tell you from my own experience, our work in Austria is very different from our work in Germany, and it's the same language family, but nonetheless, there are really differences that we have to keep in mind as well. We've certainly tried a lot of things, made a lot of mistakes, learned a lot along the way, and will continue to have to learn day by day as we build out that practice of what we do. What I'd really like to encourage you to do, therefore, with your tactics when you're talking about cultivation, asks, and stewardship, the bread and butter of fundraising, it's going to be about starting somewhere and scaling. I alluded to it myself. My organization, we're pretty strong in Germany. We still are building out on our further European operations, such as Austria and Switzerland. So just to say, we're still learning there as well. So starting somewhere and scaling, and then shaping the tactics that you're going to need. And at the end of the day, this is quite like a capital campaign. At the end of the day, how do you know when to start? Your gut instinct will have to tell you, but your team will tell you as well. You will have looked at all of the information that we've talked about today. You've gathered the market research that you need to get started, and you're going to have a sense of, yes, now it is time to go. And again, keeping your legalities, your regulations, and your cultural frameworks in mind, you will have a sense as a professional of when to start, just like you do at home. At the end of the day, there's comes the moment where you say, we're ready to go with our capital campaign. This is the time. And you may even implement a silent phase into the work that you're doing, just like with a capital campaign. I know we certainly have. To kind of round off this short bit of input, I just sort of wanted to give you a little bit of a look into what we've done at Assist with a really small matching challenge, but just to give you a sense of what we've done to try to implement all of the things that we've been talking about for the last minutes that we've been in the webinar. And really, it was just about raising funds for a scholarship. And we basically achieved the same results in 2 markets around the world, but with really different tactics. So we had a matching challenge. One half of it ran in the United States and worldwide. The second half ran in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. And again, at the end of the day, we achieved basically the same results. But what I'd like to tell you about is the fact that same campaign, but we changed the timing overseas. We changed the methods of the funding. For example, in the United States, we still do a lot of direct mail and postal mailings. That isn't, for a number of reasons we're not going to get into today, not really a good tactic for my specific practice in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. That's not to say it's not a good practice. It's just to say we changed it because we knew that about the specific market and our specific target audiences. So I wanted to point that out. How we acquire gifts, the forms of the transactions are different, and you'll hear a bit about that later, I would assume. Germans love direct debit, for example. Not every country does. We know that because we work culturally specifically, and we focus, of course, on the legalities and the regulations that shape and form our day-to-day. Language, it's not just necessary a division between English and German. I mentioned also the cultural specificities just between Germany and Austria, but also terminology. And this again is a moment where you'll step back and talk to people who are wider members of your team that can tell you about cultural nuances, what a term could mean overseas, and whether or not it's actually part of a compelling case for support. I can give more examples of that later. I also really want to say, when it comes to language, I'm going to encourage you to take out the fundraising speak, unless it's fundraising speak that really translates down to something that's immediate, transferable, and meaningful in another language. At the end of the day, in my practice, we use a lot of terms that come from the education world, such as annual fund. An annual fund isn't actually something that a German school, for example, would ever collect. Oh, and by the way, most of the German schools are funded by the German taxpayers. So at the end of the day, what I'd just like to say, and I hope this is sort of an example of what all of us are trying to convey about really getting your sense of international fundraising and what you can do to be successful in Germany. Again, just focus on this little part of the world, Germany, vis-a-vis all of Europe, and just saying, we can't even use terms necessarily that are really ubiquitous in the United States, but make no sense to our constituencies. And your wider group of experts and your wider team who are helping you expand into this new market will help you identify these things. We had a long internal discussion about this. So I just would like you to know this is stuff that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. And it's certainly also something that we struggle with as well, where we're always forced to take one step back and say, does this actually work in another culture? And what can we do to break it down into language that really does translate and bring itself over to the new cultural context you'd like to be working in. Again, we come to the regulations and the legalities. I would be excited to take questions later. We'll have to see if there's time. I'd like to stop here with just 3 recommendations. Again, start by being professional, making use of knowledge that's reflected in the webinar today and else that's out there, but not forcing yourself to be perfect. Start something, get started, get your feet wet, and scale up. Perhaps you start in Luxembourg and then you build out to Belgium, the Netherlands, whatever it may be, whatever works for your organization. Again, this is where your strategic analysis and your expert team are going to come in. And then finally, build upon whom you know and who can help you out with that. You don't have to take on this whole mission by yourself, but if you're willing to take a step back and make a great list and an audit of the things you don't know and get help on the things where you think that your team could really use an extra pair of hands, I'm convinced you'll be successful. So thank you for your attention. I'll hand it back over to you, Arnaud.
Thank you very much, Becky. These are great advices. And it's true, cultural differences are really key in fundraising. And like you said, it's sometimes within the same language. You mentioned German, but with French, I lived in Canada for 10 years. I worked in France, Belgium, Switzerland, Francophone Africa. you don't do fundraising the same way in these countries, even though we speak the same language. It's very important. There is a question on the chat from Johan. What did you change the tactics to in Germany in lieu of mailings? Does that make sense? Okay.
It makes a lot of sense. We changed it to personal outreach and to online fundraising. That also has something to do with the pool of people that we reach out to in Germany. I deal with a lot of alumni, for example, in our program, who it's almost impossible to keep track of them. I had a student assistant who was an alum, and during the short period of time she was my student assistant, she moved 4 times. Within like 2 years. So it has to do with our specific audience, but it also had to do with the fact that we're just it's much easier for us to reach people and really be able to make the ask and the appeal in language that we hope makes sense to our constituencies in Germany if we're doing it through online fundraising and emails vis-a-vis postal mailings. Now, there are a lot of German nonprofit organizations and NGOs that still work with direct mail, and I don't know if any of you go to the conferences where they ask the question every year, is direct mail dead? So I'm certainly not the right person to answer that question. I wanted to give you those caveats, but just so you also, in the hopes that this will motivate you and give you, the courage also internally to say, everybody we know overseas in whatever European country it may be is telling us this isn't going to work, and these are the plausible reasons that they give us, and they're based on legalities, regulations, and cultural nuances. And so that's why I wanted to bring that example in.
Thank you, Becky. I think the philanthropic market is really growing. Obviously, we're not at the US level, but we're aiming and getting better every day. Actually, last week, Nancy and I were at the World Art Foundations Conference in Athens, where we met a lot of European foundations, and they are very dynamic, and they want to do fundraising, and they have great projects, and it was we were really enthusiastic about these meetings we had in Athens. And now our next speaker is our managing director, Nancy Bikson. So Nancy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Arnaud, and thank you to everyone for their really insightful comments about Europe. I think that for anyone listening, and for those that are going to be listening on recordings, the one thing that should absolutely be screaming out to you after listening to everyone is how much this is going to cost. Because you really need to ensure that you are prepared for spending money. We've had over the years, I've been doing this for 25 years, cross-border philanthropy throughout the world. People who've come to us and said, we want to fundraise in Europe because we have some programs that we do there. And we've said, how much do you have? Well, £10,000. What languages do you speak? Well, nothing except English. And who do you know? Well, nobody. Now, that should be a huge, red flag that says that's not enough. That fundraising anywhere else is a costly opportunity. It can be a very effective opportunity and a very great opportunity, but you've really got to ensure that you really, as I think Emilie started by saying, you need to know why you're doing it. You need to know what countries you're choosing, why you're choosing it, and what your access to that country is. Then, of course, all the other cultural and language issues are going to hit you. So unless you really have a very good case, and not just a case for support, but a good case for why you want to do that particular country, you really need to be thinking clearly about it. We've talked a lot here about individuals, but I just did want to remind everyone that it's not just individuals, it's individuals that will give. It's also companies. And one of the great things about companies is that sometimes you don't need to know their legal issues. you can ask them, because generally they'll know a whole lot better than you'll ever know about where they'd like to give from, particularly for multinational companies. So asking them, how can they support you? The word foundations has been talked about a lot, which is of course very interesting, because foundations does slightly mean different things in different countries in Europe and around the world. So a foundation can be a charity. A foundation can also be an institutional funder. And the word trust, which is used a lot in the UK, is also an institutional funder. And then, of course, there's also the government, which can mean a national government. And in the European context, it can also mean the EU, which has opportunities both for those within the EU and those outside the EU. I think it's also worth just mentioning the UK, because I don't know whether people would consider the UK part of Europe anymore, but I think for purposes of this webinar, it's worth just mentioning, and we're going to talk about tax and legal stuff, that the climate in the UK is actually very good for fundraising and for philanthropy. It sort of inches its way more towards the American model than possibly the European model. There's a lot of activity here which hasn't been funded by government, which were funded and still are in many countries funded by government in the continental European states. Plus, there's an absolutely wonderful thing called gift aid, which means that if you raise, for example, £100 in the UK, and your donor is paying UK tax, the government will give you an additional 25%, which in effect they're giving you back the tax that was paid. So you walk away with £125 for £100 donation. So it's, as we say here, money for old rope. It means that you don't have to do anything extra except to ensure that you have a way of claiming gift aid, which is what I'm going to talk about in a moment. So don't forget the UK when you're thinking about Europe. But I think, again, the most important thing in all of this is, why are you going to be doing this particular country, rather than choosing a country you particularly like the look of and going from there. Basically, in thinking about the tax and legal issues, there is still no pan-European charity which has got a EU charitable status, because it just doesn't exist yet. It's been talked about for centuries. I mean, well, not centuries. It's been talked about for a long time, and there is still things. There are movements to at least recognize, without very much effort, a charity, for example, established in Spain that is fundraising in Germany. All of that has not yet come into play. I would like to think that it might before I'm dead, but I'm not 100% sure. It's moved very, very slowly, and we've been talking about it in at least the last 25 years that I've been sort of working here. But there are, there have been cases, though, where local governments have recognized foreign, i.e. within the EU, but foreign charities. And if you are particularly an EU charity and you're fundraising in another EU state, it is worth at least talking to the appropriate people about whether a donation from that particular state would be tax deductible, or would have the local tax benefits, even though you're registered in another EU state. It gets trickier, obviously, if you're not an EU country, but that is still talked about. It's still on the cards, and it's worth obviously watching that legislation particularly if you're working or really having big fundraising campaigns. But generally, the way that you can offer tax benefits, whatever those might be, to local donors, so if you're wanting to fundraise in Germany, if you're wanting to fundraise in France, is to get them to give to a charity within that country. And there's basically 3 ways that you're going to do that. Well, there's the first way is you just say to them, give us the money, and you don't worry about the tax benefits. And there are a lot of people who are actually very happy to do that, because there are a lot of countries in the world that don't have any tax benefits, for even those that have it within local countries don't have it if they give internationally. I mean, Australia is the big one. It will not give an Australian tax benefit for donations that leave Australia. But a lot of the countries in the world have severe limitations, or places like France, where you get a different tax deduction if you're giving to a something within the EU. So if you give to a French charity and it uses the funds to support something within the EU, there are much broader tax benefits than if it goes outside the EU, where they get very, very limited. But so the first thing is just literally to ask your donor whether they're willing to give to you directly without worrying about tax benefits. If they say yes, of course, you go through the traditional fundraising activity of banking it as quickly as possible and saying thank you as quickly as possible without worrying about anything else. Another possibility is to partner with a local legal entity, particularly places like universities that might be willing to partner with another university to achieve tax-deductible donations or tax benefits in that particular local country. It's not probably the very, very best because, you know, a donation could come into some place for you that isn't recognized in that particular, so they just bank the check and don't realize it's for you. You're going to have to do negotiations. It's just worth knowing that that's a possibility. It's also sometimes useful for some of the EU, particularly grants that need a EU partner for you to access some funds there. But it is a possibility is to work with a local legal entity that's already got charitable status in that particular country. The one that we're particularly involved in is where we or other intermediaries can take a donation and then give the money to you. I mean, there are a couple of these around. I mean, King Baudouin Foundation obviously has been very active with European charities, particularly fundraising from the US, but they are a possibility. We think we're better, but I'll tell you why in a moment. But you know, you need to at least know about them. The biggest one that you may be familiar with is Transnational Giving Europe. I have to say that for those of you who've tried it, it can be extremely cumbersome. I was actually on the committee that started it, and it was really invented as a way of helping local national foundations like the Fondation de France, like Charities Aid Foundation, etc. So it's a little bit clunky. It's a bit European. It's not always the easiest to use, and each local charity that's involved in it, national foundation, has its own rules. So you might find that a donation from Switzerland to France doesn't work in the same way as a donation from Spain to Germany and so forth. But at least it's worth knowing about Transnational Giving Europe if that's something that would be useful to you in trying to get a donation for all its clunkiness. What Chaplain York has done, we've tried to pick our two major markets within Europe, and that's Switzerland and the Netherlands. We've established charities there, a foundation in Switzerland, a Stichting in the Netherlands, and we're registering the Netherlands in France and Spain so that we can achieve tax deductibility in those markets. The way it works for us, and it's sort of similar for some of the other ones, is that you can apply to have, you become a member of Chaplain York, and you can apply to have a fund then with our foundations, and a donation comes in, we receipt for it. The point of all of this is that you're not having to deal with any of the regulatory stuff yourself. We receipt for it, you get a copy of it so that you can steward your donations as quickly as possible, because that's absolutely crucial, of course, that you treat your foreign donors with as much care and consideration that you would any other donors or local donors. And then quarterly, we make grants to the fund holders of the donations that were received. We take a very small annual fee and a very small percentage, as low as 1% of the donations that go through. So it is a way that you can fundraise in a country and receive tax effective donations without having to do your own thing. The final way is obviously to do your own separate legal entity in a particular country. It has all the problems of running another charity in another country, and the most difficult thing about doing that, you will need usually a board of trustees or board of directors or some legal group to run your thing. It's the banking. The banking is absolutely the most diabolical problem that we face, and that's not just Europe, that's everywhere in the world. Mostly because everywhere in the world, and I can say this for certain, running these things around the world, is that around the world, banks particularly are looking at charities as, rather than a good player in the way of looking after the world, as instead they're looking at them as something to be feared and loathed, because they might be giving money to terrorists. So banking is absolutely a disastrous thing. So after doing this for 25 years, and we do set up and manage charities, so I'm not saying this because we don't do that, but I really feel in these days that partnering with a local charity, whether it's us or one of the transnational giving or somebody else, is probably the very best way if you are just doing fundraising in another country. If you're going to operate, that's a whole different problem and a whole different issue, because you will want your own charity in that country, most likely. But if it's just fundraising, please do consider very carefully why you're doing what you're doing in a particular country that you're going to be working in. So I think that's probably more than enough for me. Again, thank you all very much for absolutely wonderful comments. Arnaud, back to you.
Thank you very much, Nancy. You advised not to forget UK. We'll never forget UK. Please come back. We have a few minutes for questions. If someone would like to ask a question. I have a question actually on the chat from Agnès Bernard. What is the general sense in both Europe and UK with regards to funding in Africa, more specifically South Africa? Who would like to answer this one?
Well, do you want me to start just by saying the UK is still interested in South Africa, always has been, always had a very close relationship to it. I think that I would certainly say that, like everywhere, it's who you are, what you're trying to do, and but we do fund. There is a lot of funding that comes from the UK because of the very close links between the UK and South Africa.
Yeah, go ahead, Anna.
Yes, maybe I can add to this. I mean, obviously, there is also a very close link with the Netherlands, right? Because of just the history you share. So I would not underestimate fundraising in the Netherlands for a topic in South Africa. But again, it depends on the cause. And one thing that Becky said earlier on about Germany and the fact that German schools are mainly funded by German taxpayers, it's, I think, something that we can take really into consideration, because in the Netherlands also there's a very strong tax system for some topics like education, for instance. And if you approach donors there, in terms of charitable giving for education in the Netherlands, it's very low, just because the education system as such is funded by the government, by the taxpayers, etc. So you might think about how you want to frame it. We received a lot of requests actually from South Africa to support donation processes from Germany to South Africa. So I think there is a good interest and a good base there that you could consider for fundraising for projects in South Africa. So in general, I think the fact that, and your question might link to that, you're rather a higher development, right? And that there is your own very strong support system, is that for those countries, it really depends on how you formulate the ask and how you present the cause. But I would definitely go, especially for South Africa, for the Netherlands and for Germany, as potential donor markets.
Thank you, Anna. Another question, can you please give more information on membership with Chapel in New York as the intermediary, price and benefits, etc.? Nancy?
Well, the benefit, of course, is that you can say to your donor in that particular market that they will get tax benefits for giving. We offer basically two types of memberships: an affiliate and a named fund. The affiliate costs £500 per annum, and we keep 3% of the money that comes through. The named fund is £2,000 per annum, and we keep 1%, or the charity keeps 1% of the money that comes through. There are some global memberships available, and there's some other upgrades for those that you can also do. But the whole idea is for you to be incredibly, in touch with everything. So we know what you're trying to accomplish, and we're there to help you accomplish it, and to be as responsive to your needs as possible. But anyway, and on the chats there is the link to the Chaplain York information about the foundations, so that you can see if there's anything else.
Yes, and Heather is now with us. It's good to see you, Heather. Okay, we're close to the end of the hour. I don't see any more questions on the chat. I don't see any little thumb for questions on the participants list. So I think we're going to close the webinar now. It was great. Thank you to all the speakers. Thank you for participating and your interest. If you are interested in fundraising in other countries, please get back to me. I'm the head of international fundraising. As I said, we have 35 Chaplain York experts in the world ready to help, and I'll be really happy to talk to you. So thank you very much, and have a great day, and see you at the next Chaplain York webinar. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.